Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another exciting session of hashtag Gather to Grow here with Food from Zanzi on Twitter Spaces. I'm your host, Dawn Numdu. On tonight's session of Gather to Grow, we're talking about climate adaptable crops. And it is a very broad topic, but I guess asking the right questions. And as one of my speakers actually mentioned to me, and he just showed up actually, Kunisani said that we should be focusing the conversation around sustainable practices when it comes to agriculture. And so he wanted to kind of streamline it in that way. And I'm hoping that that is what the conversation will go around. And so as a start, I'm going to ask all of my speakers to introduce themselves, tell us who they are, what they do within agriculture. And I'm going to start off with Xolise. She's a soil scientist and a senior analyst in sustainable agriculture for Green Cape. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Dawn, for having me. And I'm so happy that I'm not flying solo today. I've got my fellow speakers as well. I am Xolise Mcinga. I'm a soil scientist by profession, and I would like to think that I'm the daughter of the soil. So I currently work for an NPO. So we work at the interface between businesses, government, and the academia just to remove any barriers that exist to economically viable green economy solutions. That basically means that any economically viable technology that is a transition towards a greener, more resilient economy is what we prioritize and channeling investment towards that. So that's basically my day to day. And yeah, I would like to think that I have quite an extensive knowledge in conservation agriculture and regenerative agricultural crop production methodologies as they speak to my masters and just the fact that I also practice farming at home and I've got a farm myself. And that's just me in a nutshell.
Thank you so much. And of course, I also had the pleasure of featuring you on our Farmers Inside Track podcast. So if you want to know more about her journey within agriculture, then please do go and check that out. I had so much fun getting to know you and also just finding out a little bit more about your work and what drives you within the sector. So thank you so much for being here. And now I've missed my chance to introduce my other guest. Kunisani Kwabe is a researcher. He works with a number of organizations. He's a researcher and founder of Ubuntu Agri Resonance. He's currently a lecturer at the Southern African Wildlife College, and he also has a specific focus on conservation, agriculture, conservation specifically. And he also works as part of a team that was recently formed that's working on developing a methodology for the GDP of the poor at the United Nations Development Programme Regional Office of Rwanda. So absolutely amazing guy, but he did say that his network isn't as great because of load shedding. And guys, I'm so tired of having to use that as an excuse on this platform. I want to send all of you guys UPSs and backup power supplies so that everything can just run smoothly on this. But we do understand. So if he does come back, I would love to have him be part of the conversation. That's, of course, Kunisani Kwabe. He has written for us. He's part of the Food from Zanzi family already. So hoping to get him to talk to us as well. And then Tabile is our resident agricultural economist on Gather to Grow. Just again, introduction for those that might not know you and also just your work in agriculture. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Dawn. My name is Tabile Ngunjana. I am an agricultural economist with the National Agricultural Marketing Council based in Pretoria. So I work for the Division Market Economics Research Center within a unit of agri-food chains. So basically my work here is to do with what is happening in agriculture from the production part of it until the consumer part of it. So that's generally what I'm doing and as an agri-economist. But my research interest also goes beyond that. That is including the trade and also the macroeconomics in general. It tends to link, or at least determines, where the agricultural sector is going globally and within our borders. So yeah, in a nutshell, that is me. Always loved agriculture from where I grew up from. So part of my work is basically me in a way, because it talks to what I've always been introduced into and also grew up around. So
thank you so much, Tabile, and thank you for your willingness to contribute and be part of the conversation. Now, to set the scene, I thought it would be easier to firstly define, what we refer to when we talk about climate adaptable crops, or perhaps we can even, say resilient and adaptable produce that is more adaptable to the climate and climate change when it comes to agricultural practice. So can you maybe answer this question for us, please?
I think it's also very important to just highlight what climate adaptability is before we can dive deeper into just understanding what we mean by climate adaptable crops. Obviously, the simplest Google definition to that is that climate adaptability refers to adjustments in ecological, social, or economical systems in response to climate change. So it then refers to all of these technologies that we're wanting to adopt as a means to adapt to climate change. And it involves quite a lot of things, which include both changing what is causing the problem by reducing maybe your greenhouse emissions, like your carbon dioxide, or changing the behavior to adapt to new climatic conditions. So in the case of climate adaptable crops, it's crops that are specifically looking into, basically it's crops that are able to adapt well under a very stressful or a stressed climatic condition. If you're talking about climate adaptable crops, we're looking at sorghum, we're looking at soybeans, we're looking at, and basically just trying to create resilient systems through which we can still be able to have some productivity and at the same time taking care of the fact that the crops are being subjected to a very, very highly stressed environment and they have to thrive in that space. So it's then in simplest forms, meaning that adjusting and adapting to all of those, or maybe looking at research that focuses particularly on the different types of crops that can thrive well under those conditions.
Thank you so much. I think you've really explained it beautifully. And I was hoping we would kind of get that checklist to say, okay, you mentioned soya beans, you mentioned sorghum. You kind of given us two crops that can be grown, that are more adaptable, are more resilient to adapt to the ever-changing climate. And obviously, there's no doubt that rising temperatures and extreme weather events are increasingly affecting food security. And while I was prepping for this session, I read up on the use of nuclear and related techniques and or methods used to support climate smart agriculture. Now that sounds like a lot, even for my brain, and I'm very much new into this agricultural space. But maybe if you can explain what that means exactly. And for farmers who may not even be aware of it, how does it work? What do we think about when we refer to this?
What I can try to extract out of that, something that could make a lot more sense, is just focusing on climate smart agriculture and what it means in the context of like our country and obviously our resource constrained farmers. So when we talk about climate smart agriculture, we're looking at an integrated approach which is meant to manage or improve the productivity of croplands, livestock, forests, and sometimes fisheries. So it basically looks at all the nexus that exists in food, energy, and water, and has got aims, which is increased productivity, enhanced resilience, and again, reduced emissions. So the whole aim or the whole goal of these technologies is to basically meet our NDCs in the agriculture space and as well as look at sustainable development goals, which is for climate action, poverty eradication, and hunger. So there's quite a lot of interesting work that's been done. So upon this whole stressful topic around climate change, DAF, which is the Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries, they did have like a draft climate change adaptability and mitigation plan, which speaks to all of these adoption technologies in response to the harsh effects of climate change, especially in the context of farmers. And then they've also created policies around all of this conversation that we're having today. Like, what are the best policies that can be implemented in order to support climate smart agriculture? And at the top of my head, I'm reminded that there's actually also a lot of money that has been rolled out to also support research and development work that's wanting to support this transition. And it's work that is amazing work that has been done by the Agricultural Research Council as an example. And the CSIR has also done amazing work in the space to really look at all of these different technologies that farmers can adopt, which speak to climate smart agriculture. So a lot of it now, again, like I mentioned, it really resides or focuses mainly on the food, energy, and water nexus. So any technology that improves water use efficiency whilst minimizing energy costs while improving productivity qualifies as a climate smart agriculture. So in the energy aspect of it, a lot of conversations now have been driven towards your more renewable energy or moving away from your coal dependence and your diesel powered irrigation systems, as an example, just to hone into renewable energy solutions and fitting them into the agriculture space. And there's really been interesting technologies that are coming up online in the space. We're looking at solar powered irrigation systems, and other farmers, like bigger farmers, are looking at using solar as for their pack houses, and others are just deciding to go completely off grid. And this is all in response to what qualifies this climate smart agriculture that everybody wants to tap into. And the nicest thing is there's also a lot of policies that support this. I mean, you know that we do a lot of the times adopt technologies or policies from US. So upon their draft bill as well, that's when we decided to take on this. And I mean, the nicest thing is the transition also speaks to your regenerative agricultural production methods, which could allow you to tap into different revenue streams, which is what is becoming a lot more attractive now in the space, where people are wanting to get into it, just not only for the environmental aspects of it, but also for the economical or the economic benefit that it comes with. And the real benefit right now is people are realizing that once you get into climate smart agricultural practices, you cut down a lot on your fertilizer inputs, as an example. You get to save a lot more on your water. So a lot of people are now wanting to tap into that because they're realizing that, wait a minute, you can actually save on this as your input costs, which then unlocks a new, completely different stream. Now you can tap into your carbon credits, which is obviously supported by the crypto protocol, which identifies policies and measures which can be used to adopt all of these technologies that we're talking about.
Thank you so much, Olise. And I now know why I decided to, break this topic down into two parts, because I knew that so much would come out of the first session. And I appreciate all of your insights. As you were talking, I went and looked at the climate change bill. And I think there's a room for us to kind of break this down and also talk to some of the policies and what people should understand or what farmers should understand as they're stepping into the sector. And there's always these words that float around and you're like, okay, what does that mean? But what does that mean? So I think it's definitely worth it to kind of sit with it and talk through it and understand it from the ground up. So thank you so much for that information. Tabile, I want to bring you into the conversation as an agricultural economist, just to talk also specifically on this question, but more how you've seen a change in practice from farmers that you deal with, and also how you see it moving towards or growing towards as we continue to produce food, not only in South Africa, but Africa and globally, and how it can be sustained if we are not, moving more towards these smart agricultural practices that Sikolise mentioned.
So I think Sikolise touched on a number of key issues around this topic. But for me, I'm just going to try to link, or at least to be more focused on the issue of production, and also how does that mean in terms of the farmers and also the traders and everything else going into the global space. So at the moment, there's just a lot that is happening. And one would sense a bit of contradiction from the views and all that. For an example, if one is to at least can recall, like now, what is happening in Africa, we're going to have an important event that is going to be held in Ghana mid this year. And that talks to the issue of fertilizer use and application in food production in generally across the continent of Africa. And that's something that has been, there have been goals that have been set during the declaration in Nigeria some time ago as to how much fertilizer should be used in production of food and all that. And if one looks into it at a broader picture, is that Africa is way below compared to what is happening in other world. In fact, if one is to look into the world by region, Africa is the second least user or applier of fertilizer in food production, which is one of the reasons why it has recorded a lower yields in terms of per hectare compared to other areas. But of course, this varies across countries. because countries like South Africa at least are above the proposed amount, and some have even doubled if one looks into the countries like Seychelles. Those are doing pretty well in that. But now, if you are to go to Europe, for example, now there's an issue happening there, a proposition that farmers should use, I don't know, it's between 15 to 30% lesser nitrogen in their food production. And there's a huge strike that has been happening there. As of today, if one is following what is happening in Euro News, every day you will find that there's something happening, be it in France, Netherlands, and Germany, all those kind of things. So now the countries that are already ahead of trying to adapt to climate issues, they are developing, or at least they are diverting to an entirely different kind of an approach. But those that are still very low or below the standard production of food in general, they are trying to catch up. So there are this contradiction. And of course, now if one brings in the market into all this, there's just a lot that is happening. As Close already again said, that if one is to export, for example, into the EU, there are just a lot that is happening there, policies that are being put. In fact, the EU is working with countries across the world where they are approaching them in terms of how the food that they are to buy should be produced, and the practices in general, that is, you're using a renewable energy to produce that food. If one can look sort of a technically barrier to trade, for example, take the issue of citrus here in South Africa now. We have a citrus that you don't know what they're going to do with it. Around 36% of our citrus goes to Europe. And as of today, there's still a huge question around that, because EU requires certain standard around that. And that's something that we cannot be able to do given the implications and finances and of course, the cost, which is one thing that cannot happen over 2 months. It's going to take time. So also, if one is to go to other regions, Brazil, for example, is a huge producer of a number of key commodities. And soybean is one of the key commodities that they do very well in. But because of climate change, it is estimated that a lot of their harvest, or at least their yields, are going to be reduced, specifically because of climate-related issues. The same thing is applied. It's been said about coffee production in other key countries like in North South America, Colombia, and all that. So climate is a serious issue. But now, of course, there are propositions in terms of what farmers should be doing, in terms of bringing in integrated systems in all this. But of course, it's still a new thing, and research is being done. But for farmers that gonna easily tap into that, or at least adapt to the current production systems, they're gonna be able to do very well. The same thing it applies for poultry, for example. If you're to look into the market in America, at the moment there's a huge, or at least there's an increasing trend, particularly for poultry production there. Those folks, they're looking into a range kind of a thing, and also which has minimally production, at least use of GMOs and all those kind of things. So there's just a lot that is happening, but I mean, it's still a new topic. But I think for farmers that are interested in specific production, or at least commodities, it's going to be important that they keep up into what is happening in global, and of course the requirements that comes for certain products to get into certain countries, as it is the case, for example, in South Africa for citrus. It may not necessarily be climate related, but it's still something that farmers need to adhere to be able to get into certain markets.
Thank you so much, Tabile. And as always, and I think that's why it's so vital to kind of have an economist in the space to give you a broader perspective on the topic. So thank you always for your contributions. And I think an important aspect and something that I jotted down was obviously the influence your practice on farm level has in terms of trade and export. And that's something that we can maybe factor into the next conversation around this topic, because I'm hoping to have a part 2 on this as well. Sitholise, maybe you can come back into the conversation also if you'd like to respond to some of the points that Tabile made. And then my other question is just trying to bring it down, this concept, and thinking around how farmers operate. If it's a farmer and she's operating somewhere in the country, how does this person think about changing over their practice to farming regeneratively or using these smart agricultural practices? And does it happen gradually? Does scale matter? That's always an important question, because we have very different farmers in the space. So you might be starting out, you might be in a medium scale, or you might be even on a commercial level already. So maybe just keeping all of those aspects in mind. I do know that in preparing for this session, a lot of the experts said you can't talk about it, like it's too broad. So you have to bring it and narrow it down a little bit. So I'm hoping that this is a base for another conversation that we'll have next week. Policy, over to you.
Just to piggyback on what Tabile was saying around the EU markets and them having a very strict policy around the kind of produce that we can export, I think as unfair as it is, it's a very good baseline to have like systems in place that will enable you to be able to tap into the export market. Because like he was also, we cannot stress enough how much it is important to adhere to all of these policies that everybody puts in place, especially if you want to play in the export market. So I think a lot of the times we find that farmers are gradually becoming interested in these conversations, especially your now more commercial farmers, because everybody wants to play in the export market. Everybody wants their produce to go. So I think putting all of these systems in place has sort of like created or changed the mindset of farmers into wanting to tap a lot more on the technologies that are going to be able to get them there. I was driving coming back from Eastern Cape not so long ago, and you see that one of the EU recommendations around the whole citrus production was they need even the trees to be under a shade net, this and that and that. I mean, they had very strict rules in terms of what will then qualify to go to the export market. Just having those as very nice baseline systems that we can adopt gives a very nice baseline of that quality produce that we can actually produce and to be able to export. And just coming back to your question around the transition to more regenerative agricultural practices, it really depends. Remember, like you were saying, that we've got different farmers, like we've got farmers who are playing at different levels. We've got your smaller scale farmers who I think from the engagements that I've been having and just from the insights that we've been getting from the different stakeholder engagements that we've had, we realize that it's a lot easier for smaller farmers to tap into regenerative agricultural practices because they have not farmed before. So all of the capacity building, all of the new information that is now currently available is what they want to consume, and it is what they want to regurgitate. It is what they want to use to tap into the primary production level. But then at your more medium SMMEs and your medium farmers, we find that the transition is still people want to transition, but then it's an issue around costs. And I think I like where like even the government is wanting to incentivize people who are wanting to get into your more regenerative agricultural practices. And also not to advertise my job, but it is also our mandate to assist any farmer or any person who wants to transition into green, economically viable new solutions. So by doing all of these different interventions, I think we sort of like unlocking the financial barrier, which becomes the biggest in terms of people not being able to tap into that space. And then for your larger, more commercial and your more matured farmers in the space, we find that it's quite hard for them to do the transition because the monocultural production, as an example, is all that they know. But now, because of the benefit of all of these different revenue streams you can tap into by just converting to now regenerative agricultural practices, we see that there's a lot of appetite now that's happening in the space. You find farmers wanting to know a little bit more about the kinds of implements, as an example, or just technologies in general that they can adopt to venture into these different technologies. So it looks like it's a topic that's slowly gaining traction. And I think the biggest selling point right now is the fact that when you do the transition, you cut down on your input costs, which is what every farmer is interested in. Everybody wants to know, how can I produce more for less? You know what I mean? And obviously maximize productivity in the process. And also now with the new different revenue stream altogether, which is around your carbon trading, a lot of farmers are now becoming more and more interested in it. And also there's been a lot of work that's done. I'll speak for the Western Cape province, which I've been watching very closely as well. In the context of South Africa, there's also been a lot of support that is now being issued to farmers who are wanting to do that transition. So I think that's something we could also learn from as different provinces as well, and as different farmers, to then say, you can make the transition, but then these are some of the things that you will have to take note of. And just obviously knocking at the Department of Agriculture to get funding around like the different technologies that you can tap into, because we cannot run away from the fact that these things are quite expensive. You can't just wake up one day and be like, okay, I'm done with this kind of production. I want to tap into that. I mean, there's a lot of financial things that you have to consider for you to be able to make that transition. It's very interesting to see that at different levels, you get different results for farmers. I don't know if you've noticed that, Tabile, or it's a different observation altogether on your end.
Thank you so much, Polisa. And maybe before Tabile, I'm sure you want to respond to what you're saying. I'm just thinking in the back of my mind as you were talking, perhaps there's an opportunity for us to actually do a province by province type of assessment. I'm sure this type of research is being done by NMC, ARC, all of these organizations, but it would be worth it to kind of do it from our perspective to say, okay, farmers, here's your list, here's the support. If you're considering it, here's where you should go to. I think that would be a very interesting topic to have so that you can decide for yourself whether you're sitting in the Western Cape, where I'm based, or whether you're in Gauteng. Wherever you're at, you can kind of decide what is the support that's out there and how can you transition into this different kind of practice if you're not doing it already, or maybe how you can advance if you are doing it and you want more support to be able to extend this practice on your farm. I'm not sure if that would be a great idea. Skolisa, I think you unmuted your mic.
Going to say most definitely. I think that would be the best approach. And you know how each province is very competitive and everybody wants to be the best. So I do think that it would be a nice approach, especially at primary production, because every farmer wants to be the best. So I think it would also accelerate the whole adoption process as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. I love that. It's something that Food from Zanzi can kind of take on and run with and see how we can make a magic with it. Tabile, you have the floor.
This policy is mentioning such an important point, particularly about the differences across the sector. That is, if, for an example, one is to look into the wine industry, there's an industry that has been growing with the trends in the global space, which is why you see a lot of people outside the country buying a lot of farms, particularly within that wine space, because that industry has kind of adapted to the current issues, that is practicing in a good agricultural production. And that's why part of Western Cape tends to do well in some of these things, because it has always been geared toward the standards into the global market. So that's some of the issues. I think as far as the field crops is concerned, I think for me, that's where the issue it is going to be, as Sikolsis mentioned that, because, we have 50 hectares of land that is just a field that is open out there. Now imagine how that farm has been doing that for the past 20 years, or even before that, it has been some 30, some 50 years, and so on and so on. So it is not going to be an easy thing to kind of integrate into the current system. As I said earlier on, that it appears to be a lot of contradictions in some of the things that are being proposed. If one looks, for an example, to a rice production across the world, it is mostly produced in Asia, and the farmers that are producing that are mostly small or emerging farmers, if you are to compare to the context of South Africa. And however, they are using a lot of these fertilizers and all that kind of thing. And if, for an example, Thailand was to change that, it has so much implications, or for an example, India, because those are some of the key countries that are producing that. Now imagine, because we have a situation where we are looking into food security and also trying to adopt, the other new measures to ensure that we have lands that are going to sustain us for a very long time, which is one of the reasons that South Africa tends to have when it compared to the world. It has some of the soils that have been overly used because of the way or the practices, especially if one goes to the grain production space. And that is where the issue is going to be, especially for commercial farmers. If you are small, I don't think it's going to be a problem. South Africa is doing very well in adopting new technology. And that's why, like now, I can tell you that we are doing pretty well in exporting vegetables now into EU, despite the issues that we had with our neighbors last year. But now it looks like we are opening up a little bit. And that, of course, it has to do with the climate issues again. EU at the moment is going through some difficulties. A lot of production is kind of being impacted by a couple of things. That's why you see a lot of countries having shortages in basic foods. In the UK, there's an article published last week where they're saying that consumers are said to be buying certain products in vegetables. That's a very basic product that one would not think it would be at a short supply. You see, so now we are caught between balancing in the supply of food and also making sure that we have a sustainable practices in agriculture. So in South Africa, I think we're going to have an issue, especially for the larger commercialized farm, which is exactly what is happening, in fact, to the citrus industry, because that's one older industry in South Africa, and it has been doing pretty well. But unfortunately, we are bound to have these changes, and somehow we're going to have to adapt to them. And the sad part of it is that it also has implications for jobs. A lot of people are employed in the citrus industry, both in primary production and across the value chain. So imagine if the biggest market of that industry is going through what it's going through now. You can imagine the implications to that. So, of course, it is not going to be easy, but Asipolis has managed to pick this up very well in terms of that. It is going to be very difficult, especially for the larger, bigger commercial farmers, especially those who were always been practicing, the traditional ways of doing agriculture. Unfortunately, that's another field that we are doing pretty well into the global market, particularly Asia now. So hopefully we're going to try to ensure at least the state is pushing the agenda to ensure that we are not getting behind in a lot of that, but it's going to take a minute, take a lot of cost around it, which is why there's a lot of money that is being geared towards that. I know it's going to be a painful process, especially for those that have been in the industry for some time, but I think we can do it. Of course, it's going to take a minute.
Thank you so much. I want to just touch on a question that we got on the tweet here. This one comes from Health for Mzansi, our sister publication. Absolutely amazing publication, guys, for all things health. Kasi Health, please do go and check it out as well. The comment is, love the conversation. And the question is there a marketing effort in South Africa and globally around some of the lesser known climate smart crops? Sikolisa, can I give it to you? And then maybe if Tabile also wants to touch on it, he's welcome to. Thanks.
I think there has been efforts to really look into the marketing strategies and also playing in the international market. But I think just before I get into that, I think I want to highlight the fact that there's also been a lot of, I think Tabile did highlight that there's also been a lot of movement in the agri space for the past couple of years. And it looks like not only are we wanting to produce the food that we know as South Africa, but then also tapping into the different foods that you find in different countries, because South Africa is a diverse country and hosts quite a lot of different people from all sorts of places in the world. So it's also interesting to see that there's also been a huge market that's opened literally because of the fact that there's people who are in South Africa and who are wanting to have their native foods grown in the country that they live in. So I think that was quite interesting, and I thought it would be important to just flag that as well. And on the market side of things, yes, there's also been a lot of conversations, especially with special economic zones who are wanting to tap into the different marketing techniques and as well as exposing farmers to different markets and just for them to understand what it means to tap into the international market. So I do think that there's quite a lot of work that's happening in the space as well. Not too sure if that's your observation as well, Tabile, but from what I've seen, a lot of this requires people not to work in silos. But what is interesting now is that it looks like the farmers themselves in a space where they're able to trust the Department of Agriculture, locally, provincially, and nationally for all of these important insights that they can benefit from. So also just getting in touch with the special economic zones and just wanting to get any information on how to approach the international market or just the market in general. I think there's been also amazing work that's just done by our local companies as well. I'm just reminded of a guy who's actually integrating all smallholder farmers and just exposing them to a formal market, because all they knew before that was just selling their produce in stalls. But now he has sort of exposed them to a more formal market, which is now integrating all of their produce and maybe selling it to one of the retail outlets. So there's been a lot of work that's happening in the space, and I'm not too sure if that is your own observation. Tabile, you can speak on that as well.
Thank you so much. Tabile, your last comment on that question, perhaps?
Stolisa is correct about the new approach that is being taken, particularly the department. We tend to underestimate the type of work that some of the state entities are doing. They might not be the best if one is to compare to perhaps one of the organizations and all that, but there's a lot of work that those guys are doing. Now there's what they call information days. Those kind of things that are putting information to new farmers to get to understand certain things. And, look, now you will have a country outside, coming to South Africa. Recently I've seen one of the Asian countries going to countries like Kenya and Tanzania because they know that those countries are doing pretty well in producing avocado. So those countries, they know those countries have a potential in producing that. But now what they are doing, they are bringing in the expertise from their native countries as to how they should produce certain food to ensure that they continue meeting the standards that they put out there. And that is something, as much as South Africa has been advanced in terms of adopting certain things, production practices and all that, we have been sort of slowly in that, but I think we were picking up pretty well for now. And it's something that I think is going to continue, especially now that we have realized how important it is to have standardized, because it's going that direction where everything is standardized. That is, consumers are getting more conscious about certain things. One wants to know exactly where the egg that is buying is going to. For an example, look at how much the requirements of exporting eggs into North Europe. It's just ridiculous if you look into it. But once you get into understand, at least you read why they want that, you will understand. But of course, it's not every farmer who's going to be able to meet that, but those that can are doing very well in those markets, which is why now we are seeing a lot of shortages. Go to America, you'll see what I'm talking about. So there's just a lot happening, but it is important that you share, relevant information timely, so that at least we don't get to be cut off of the market.
Thank you so much, Tabile. I have one more question on my side. I think this definitely sets the scene for the part 2 of this conversation. And then I think my last question would specifically be around, how do we take all of what was said into account? I think I mentioned before, how do we put this into practice, especially considering the different farming regions, climate variations, rainfall patterns, just to name a few factors across the country because of our beautiful climate and how it's very different in different parts of where we live. What is the baseline, if there is any, and how should we start thinking about it? Because I think you mentioned, Sitali said that soya beans and sorghum is the 2 crops that you can definitely say are more climate adaptable crops. I would like you to maybe respond first, and then I'll also get Tabile to touch on it. Thank you so much.
Just to touch on climate resilience, or maybe climate resilient crops, I can't really say there is a baseline, but there is a definition of what qualifies as that. And it has to be a crop that's early maturing, as an example, if it's a cereal. So there's a lot of work that has been done by the Agricultural Research Council just to tap into that space to really understand how we can tweak different varieties to produce early maturing varieties as well. Heat tolerant varieties, as an example, drought tolerant legumes or tuber crops, and just crops that are able to withstand very harsh climatic conditions. And of course, like you were mentioning, we've got a very different climate across different regions of South Africa. So one crop might work very well in a particular region and another in a different region. So it's also very important to also understand what you're on about and just understand your climate and what you are wanting to achieve out of you being as a farmer. So I think that would qualify as sort of like a baseline or just a guideline onto what to tap into as a farmer.
Thank you so much. Tabile, over to you.
For me, there's not much that I would say around this, but I mean, as well aware that South Africa has a very diverse, climate conditions. I mean, if you are to compare with the Western Cape, which is why we tend to have a lot of our wheat produced there, it is specifically because of that. Or maybe if I were to look into the Kara region, where, for an example, we have livestock that is specific into that area alone, it is because of the climate conditions or requirements that are out there, or at least certain commodities require. So we are currently seeing a lot of transitioning from. That is why if you are to look into the grain space, there's tend to be a lot of movement between certain grains and all that. It is specifically because of that. For example, if you are to look at how much farmers have moved from maize to sunflower because of certain time issues, and then of course because some were late because of rains and all those kind of things, or because of drought and all those kind of things. So I think we have such a climate that allows us to produce quite a variety of products. But I think what is important now is to be able to have varieties that are going to be resilient to certain things. And of course, we need to take into consideration the situation around, having a diverse kind of practices or systems, because where the current global agriculture is going, it is going to be very standardized, meaning what or how a product is produced in Northern Ireland, it is how it should be produced in South Africa. The same applies for Kenya. So we are getting into that. So it is important that we keep up to date with what is happening. We're going to be fine. I mean, we have such a resilient industry if one is to look into the current situation and, of course, the previous or the history of our sector. I will stop there, Alton. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tabile. On a very personal note, whenever I hear the word resilient, I'm always triggered because we don't want to be resilient anymore. Can't things just be easier? Anyway, that was me. That was me like trailing a little bit, Askies. But basically, what I'm saying is, I hear you and I'm there all the time. A resilient nation, a resilient sector. But yeah, we need things to go our way just a little bit. But maybe just last round of comments on this topic. Any advice, final advice that you have for farmers? I'm going to give Tabile a go first. I always love hearing from a woman last. It's just like that last voice in your head. Tabile.
If I can just general comment around the topic, I would say particularly for the folks that are interested in farming or getting into it, there's just so much that is happening now. In fact, if we are to start, I think we are even at the advantaged side because what is happening now is going to shape the future of the agricultural sector because just generally we are operating not in a vacuum as a country. We are very much into the global market. So understanding these kind of topics, it is going to give you an advantage in terms of what is happening there in the market that you like to get into, the agreements that are being signed, the agendas, because some would say it's an agenda, but somehow if you are to look into details of it, it is what it is, and it's going to shape what is happening in this industry. And of course, one is going to either get into it or get off the sector, as it is the case for a number of farmers. In South America, I think I've seen some issues with Argentina, for an example. At the moment, there's just a lot happening there, which is why it is important to have policies like, supporting the transition from biofuel-based energy into renewables and all those kind of things. So I think it's important to keep up to date. I mean, there are a lot of sites that are available out there that have very useful information. It doesn't necessarily to be in South Africa, but as long as you are interested in something or in farming in general, you will always find very useful information. Thanks again for having me on the space.
It's always a pleasure to be late. Say just the last word from you. And thank you so much for both of your contributions tonight. I really value it so much. I owe people so many coffees, guys. Like, I have to, whenever I go to your province, you better make sure that you remind me of that I have to give you. So over to you, Sipolise.
Now I'm just reminded that someone really owes me coffee.
I do.
Thank you so much, Dawn. It's always a pleasure being in these spaces because, I mean, it's not just a thing of just saying stuff, but then I learned so much literally from Tabile and just from this engagement as well. So I really appreciate being in this space as well. But just as my final words, I think I'm going to piggyback exactly on what Tabile was saying, that if any farmer is wanting to get into agricultural production, which is literally one of the fastest growing industries in our country right now, I would say this is your time to start because I think we're doing an amazing job in just creating the right kind of environment for all of those technologies, new technologies to thrive, and for any and every farmer from anywhere in any area of South Africa to thrive in. So everyone to really make use of all of these resources and knowledge products that are being produced by the different companies that speak to like the agriculture space. And because you're really going to benefit quite a lot. And there's a lot of capacity building around the different topics that are arising in the agri space. So it's exciting times and I'm very excited to be a part of the agri space. I'm flexing now. Thank you so much.
Even me, I love it so much. And looking forward to part 2 of the session. We'll welcome Wafik Esop, and I've also sent a request to Professor Jacques Werner. He's from the Northwest University. He's a botanist. Wafik, I think he's been on some of our sessions before. He's an agronomist as well. So looking forward to have them on the space next week. And then you guys know I have to have a female voice. So I'll try and get another woman to also come and contribute to next week's session. And it will be part 2 of it. To send out a very special shout out, guys, to Akolile. He was here from the beginning and he stayed all the way. So thank you so much. And also to my regulars. I love you guys. I do this for you. I enjoy so much to have these conversations because I learn so much and it's always just lovely to pick the brains of our experts in the field and people who work on this topics and research on this level all the time, every day, day to day. So thank you so much. In my feelings about tonight. But there, I said it. So all the best with your farming journeys, with whatever you're busy with, everything of the best. We support you, we salute you, and thank you so much. From me, Donum, to your host, have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.